Hello everybody, welcome to our next lesson here, talking about women and equality for May 24th, 2018, for today's date here. So our objectives and standards: to explain the goals of feminism and analyze the fight for equality by women. And if you would please take a look at the standards. So our desired result: what equal rights did women gain? Okay, so women joined the equal rights movement just like other groups around the country. Again, African Americans, civil rights movement, Native Americans, Latinos, a lot of different civil rights movements going on in the 1960s and 1970s. The movement focused on feminism in the 1960s. And one of the reasons that starts this movement is that 40% of women were working by 1960. But women were only limited to certain jobs, such as secretaries, nurses, or teachers. And many of these jobs paid very little as well. Now, President Kennedy created the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women in 1961 to kind of look at, what was going on with women's pay and things like that. So in 1963, the commission reported that women were paid much less than men, even if they were in the same jobs. So even if women had the same job as men, they were paid less than what a male was making. Women were also promoted to promotions infrequently, so they didn't receive many management positions or supervisor positions or things like that. And because of this, women began to form small groups and began discussing their experiences with discrimination and things like that, harassment. And one of the things that came out at this time was a book known as The Feminine Mystique, and it became a bestseller and pushed many women together to work for change. In 1966, 28 women, including the author of The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan, created the National Organization for Women, or NOW. And they pushed for a couple of things. They pushed for the creation of child care facilities so mothers could pursue jobs and education. And they also looked for a strict enforcement on the ban of gender discrimination hiring. The National Organization for Women was successful at bringing about some changes. Sex-segregated ads for job hiring were banned. In other words, showing a woman, only hired as a secretary in certain positions, or showing only men as businessmen and things like that. So those types of ads for hiring are going to be banned. Employers could not refuse to hire women for a typical male position. And there were other women's rights groups that emerged as well. One of these, in 1968, the New York Radical Women held protests and threw away their female articles of clothing and similar objects in unity. And in 1971, Gloria Steinem founded the National Women's Political Caucus that encouraged women to seek political office. Now, there were other forms of protest as well, such as not using certain terms. A lot of women began to use the term Miss instead of Mrs., like MRS or MISS. A lot of women began to use just MS in front of their names to signify their separation from men. And some women even decided not to take their husband's last name in forms of protest. In 1972, Congress passed a ban on gender discrimination in any education program or activities that receive federal assistance and part of the Higher Education Act. So in a lot of universities and colleges, some women's sports teams were not there, or they weren't allowed to participate. So this changes that. Also, in terms of colleges and universities, several all-male colleges opened their doors to female admissions, and working parents began to receive a tax credit in terms of child care expenses. Now, there was some controversy in terms of this movement. A conflict arose over the right of a woman to have an abortion. In 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that a woman does have the right to have an abortion within the first 3 months of pregnancy. And many thought that after the Supreme Court ruled on this topic that the issue would be settled and there wouldn't be any more controversy over it. However, I'm sure as many of you are aware, the issue is still very heated and debated today in society and across our country about the right to abortion for women. So the issue still is debated today, even though the Supreme Court officially made a ruling on it. In 1972, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, which had been promoted back in 1923 and had been discussed back then. Now, Congress passed the amendment, but in terms of our government, Congress can pass an amendment, but it needs to be approved by the states. So 38 states needed to approve the amendment, but there was fierce opposition to the amendment. And one of the leaders of this movement, this anti-ERA movement, was Phyllis Schlafly. And she stated that the amendment would ruin the lives of women and families across the country. So again, there was a lot of opposition to the women's rights movement as well, just as in terms of civil rights for African Americans and other groups as well. Women were not immune to opposition to their movement. Now, to counteract the protests of the women's equal rights movement, many conservatives created what was called the New Right in the 1970s. They were focused on, making families stronger and things like that. And they begin to build this grassroots organization, which will have success in the coming years in terms of politics, in electing conservative leaders and things like that. Now, the ERA was also defeated by a slim margin of the states, so the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass, and that was due in part to the opposition to it. But on a, I guess, more positive note, more women began to work and raise families at the same time. So women are going to have full-time jobs and raise a family instead of just staying home and taking care of the house and the kids. Careers also opened up for many women in different professions: doctors, lawyers, professors. So we begin to see that as well. And we also begin to see women elected to political offices around the country in terms of government and things like that. So here we have a picture of women protesting women's liberation. Many women looked for more freedom and equality for men, or from rules that only applied to men necessarily, and they felt like they were restricted. So a lot of women did join this movement in the 1960s and 1970s, and we can still kind of say that maybe some of this is still going on today as well. And our closure, what rights did women gain? So think about some of the laws, some of the struggles, some of the new rights that women are going to push for. Some of them they're going to gain, some of them they're not. But that will help you answer your question at the end there. All right, so have a great rest of your day or night, and I'll talk to you soon.